The prairie was flat and endless, a sweeping desolation of cracked earth and brittle yellow grass that bent low beneath the weight of heat and wind. There were no trees out here, no shade, no shelter from the sky that hung above like molten brass. To the west, black clouds gathered in thick, oily towers, dragging veils of distant rain across hills so far away they might have been painted onto the horizon. The air smelled of dust, scorched earth, and the faint metallic tang that comes before thunder. A river twisted through the emptiness, a narrow, crooked thread of silver that flashed in the last slant of light. It was the only water for 30 miles, the only living artery in a land that God seemed to have abandoned. On a low shelf above one sharp bend, where the current ran shallow and the banks were crumbling clay, a woman knelt in the dirt with a hammer in her blistered hands. She was trying to build something. A shelter, maybe. It was hard to tell. The boards she hammered were crooked charred on one side, warped from some long-ago fire. They split when she drove nails through them. She drove them anyway. Her name was Beatrice Albrecht. She was 27 years old, though the hollows beneath her cheekbones and the exhaustion in her eyes made her look older. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins hours ago and hung in tangled strands across her face. She did not stop to tuck them back. Every board mattered, every nail. The storm was coming, and she had 2 children who needed walls. Up on the northern rise, a rider sat motionless on the back of a spotted horse. He wore faded buckskin leggings and a long feathered headband eagle feathers bound with sinew and red cloth that snapped and rattled in the wind. His face was hard, impassive, carved from stone and silence. His name was Chayton. He was 28. His rifle rested across his thighs, and his eyes tracked the woman below with the same steady attention he might give to weather or wolves. Beyond him, along the distant ridge, more riders moved like dark pins against the sky. Chayton did not need to count them to know who they were. Frederick Doyle's men. Cattle company riders armed and paid to keep the valley clear of anyone who did not carry Doyle's brand. The storm was rolling closer. So were the riders. Chayton touched his heels to the pony and started down the slope. Behind his saddle, a bundle of straight lumber was lashed tight with rawhide cord. The woman was alone. The storm was close, and those riders were getting closer still. Chayton carried the quiet gravity of a man who had learned early and hard that the world did not bend to hope. The scar along his ribs, pale and puckered, running from spine to sternum, was a gift from an army winter raid that had shattered his band's camp when he was 12. He remembered the smoke, the screaming, the way his mother had shoved him toward the frozen creek and told him to run. She had not followed. Neither had his father. Chayton had run, and he had survived. That was what mattered. Now he led a small band, 37 souls, mostly women, children, and elders, camped along this stretch of river near the white settlement called Buffalo Crossing. They fished the shallow bends. They gathered plums and wild onions. They grazed their few horses on patches of short grass that the ranchers had not yet fenced. It was not enough to thrive. It was barely enough to survive. Frederick Doyle was working to change even that. Doyle owned most of the valley now, or claimed to. He had strung barbed wire across old trails, built a rough log and stone dam on the tributary creek, and hired enough guns to make his word into law. Anyone who crossed him found their access gate locked, their water cut off, or their cabin visited by riders who did not bother to hide their faces. The sheriff looked the other way. The territorial authorities were too far away to care. Doyle was building an empire, one stolen acre at a time, and he was very good at it. Chayton had watched it happen for 3 years. He had learned to move carefully to keep his rifle clean and his back to something solid. He did not trust soldiers, and he trusted cattle barons even less. But he had also learned that survival sometimes required small alliances, temporary truces with people who would otherwise die alone. The woman hammering boards into the dirt was going to die alone if someone did not help her. Her name was Beatrice Albrecht. She had come west with a husband. Cholera had taken him somewhere past the Missouri before they ever saw the valley. On the wagon train, she had taken responsibility for 2 orphaned girls, Frida 10 and Alma 7, and promised to keep them together. When the other families turned north toward Oregon, Bea stayed behind with the girls. She used the last of her money to buy a small claim along the river. She had plans. A school, maybe. A boarding house. She was a teacher or had been back in Pennsylvania. When she finally reached her claim 2 weeks ago, she found ash. The shack was burned to the ground. The well had been fouled with rotting meat. Doyle's riders had informed her with cold politeness that the land had changed ownership. She had taken the girls into Buffalo Crossing and begged Dr. Eleanor Finch to shelter them. Then she walked back to the river alone. Chayton had been watching her for 3 days. He had expected her to give up after the first night. She did not. There was something else gnawing at him, something he did not speak of aloud. 2 weeks ago, scouting Doyle's northern range, he had found a beaded pouch near a fence post, the kind his people made. Inside was a small carved stone he recognized immediately. It had belonged to his younger brother, Sewili. But Sewili had vanished months ago, swallowed by anger and grief after his woman died during a hard winter. The pouch's presence near Doyle's land troubled Chayton more than he cared to admit. He told himself it was nothing. Someone had traded it, lost it. But the seed of suspicion had been planted, and it would not let him rest. Chayton rode down the slope as the first low rumble of thunder rolled across the valley. His horse picked its way carefully over loose stones and dry earth. When he reached the shelf, he reined in several yards from where Bea was working. She did not look up. She drove another nail. The hammer rang dull against iron. The board shuddered but held. "But you brace that wall the way you are." Chayton said, his voice low, and even the first strong wind will tear it apart. Bea paused, hammer raised. She finally looked at him. Her face was lean, sunburned, streaked with dirt. Her eyes were pale blue and exhausted. "The first strong wind already took everything else," she said. Her voice was flat without self-pity. "It can wait its turn." Chayton almost smiled. Instead, he swung down from the saddle and untied the bundle of lumber. He carried it over, pulled a small hatchet from his belt, marked a spot 8 feet from her corner post, and drove a new post into the ground with hard, precise blows. The sound echoed across the empty prairie, sharp, rhythmic final. Bea watched. Chayton leaned one of the straight boards against the new post, angling it so the wind would press it down instead of lifting it away. He tapped the board with his knuckles. "Wind comes from the west. Lean it this way." She studied the angle, nodded slowly. "All right." He handed her a nail. Their fingers did not touch. She took it and drove it home. The board held. They worked in silence for the next hour. When a sudden gust drove grit and dust into her eyes, Chayton shifted without thinking, putting his body between her and the blast. His shoulder came within inches of hers. She wiped her eyes, glanced at him, said nothing. But something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement, a recognition of shared necessity. They were still at it when hoofbeats sounded from the trail below. Chayton's hand moved instinctively to his rifle. Bea straightened hammer loose in her grip. A single rider appeared. He was thick-shouldered, pale blonde hair going gray at the temples. He wore a cattleman's hat, leather chaps, and a revolver on his hip. His face was lined and weary, the face of a man who had stopped asking himself difficult questions. "B," he said. His accent was thick German. "You cannot stay here." "Wolfgang B," I answered. There was no warmth in her voice. "I am staying." Wolfgang's eyes flicked to Chayton, then back to B. "Doyle says this bend belongs to his company now. He has papers." "My husband's name is on the claim," B said, lifting her chin. "I paid for it." Wolfgang shifted in the saddle. He looked uncomfortable. "Then bring your paper to town. Do not sleep where his men ride at night." He glanced at the darkening sky. "Storm is coming." "I have nowhere else to go," B said simply. Wolfgang looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, regret, maybe, or guilt. "I am sorry," he said quietly. Then he touched his hat brim and turned his horse back down the trail. Chayton waited until the hoofbeats faded. "You know him?" "Wagon train," B said. She picked up the hammer. "He was kind to the girls when they were sick. Now he works for Doyle." That night the storm hit. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines. Rain drove sideways across the prairie, hammering the half-finished shelter with brutal force. B and Chayton crouched beneath it, water dripping through gaps in the roof, soaking their clothes, pooling around their boots. Across the river on the far bank, a settler cabin flared suddenly into flame, bright orange against the black sky. Riders circled it, then vanished into the rain. The fire-collapsed inward roof, caving with a shower of sparks. B watched it die. Her hands resting on her knees began to tremble. Chayton saw. He did not speak. He simply shifted closer, blocking the rain that was driving into her face. His presence was solid, deliberate, a wall between her and the storm. She looked at him. Water streamed down her cheeks. They burned it. Yes. Why? Because they can. She turned back to the glowing embers across the water. "Then we are all just waiting for our turn." "Maybe," Chayton said. His voice was quiet, steady. "Or maybe we make it cost more than they want to pay." She met his eyes. In the flicker of distant firelight, she saw something that was not hope. It was harder than that. Refusal. The refusal to lie down. "All right," she said. Morning came cold and pale, the storm blown east. B woke stiff and damp under a wool blanket that had not been there when she fell asleep. Chayton was already up, crouched by a small fire boiling coffee in a blackened tin pot. "We ride to town," he said without preamble. "You bring your paper. I bring a witness." She rubbed her face, trying to shake off exhaustion. "A witness to what?" "To the fact that you are still here, that you did not abandon the claim." She thought about that, nodded. "I need to get the girls first." They rode to Buffalo Crossing together, B on a borrowed mule from Dr. Finch's stable, Chayton on his pony, staying a careful distance behind so as not to walk into town beside her. A white woman and a Lakota man riding together drew the wrong kind of attention. When they reached the edge of town, Chayton stopped and dismounted near a water trough, visible but separate. Frida and Alma were waiting on the porch of Dr. Finch's small plank house. Frida was dark-haired, serious, her eyes too old for her face. Alma was lighter, nervous, always chewing her sleeve when she was frightened. "Miss B." Alma ran to her thin arms, wrapping around her waist. "Not yet," B said gently, smoothing the girl's hair. "But soon." Dr. Eleanora Finch stepped out onto the porch, drying her hands on a rag. She was a tall woman in her 30s, with sharp gray eyes and a no-nonsense way of moving that came from years of setting bones and stitching wounds in a place where mistakes meant death. People gossiped about her, said she was too independent, too cold, too willing to treat Indians and drifters without asking questions. She ignored them. "You look like hell, Bea," Eleonora said. "Feel like it too." Eleonora glanced past her at Chayton, who stood beside his pony near the trough. "He helping you?" "Yes." "Good." She handed Bea a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Bread and dried meat. You will need your strength if you are going to argue with Pike." Sheriff Thaddeus Pike kept an office in the back of the general store. He was a lean man in his 50s, with a drooping mustache and the perpetual look of someone who wished he were somewhere else. When Bea walked in with Frida and Alma, he looked up from a ledger and sighed. "Bea," he said, "I heard you were back." "I need to see my claim papers," she said. Pike wiped sweat from the back of his neck. "You sure you want to do that?" "Yes." He pulled a heavy ledger from a shelf and flipped through the pages. After a moment, he turned it around so she could see. Her husband's name was there, along with the claim number and the parcel description. But beneath it in different ink was a second entry transfer to Doyle Cattle Company. Basis abandonment. "I did not abandon it." Bea set her voice tight. "I just had not reached it yet." Pike shrugged. "Paper says you left. Hard to fight a company with that many lawyers, Bea." "Who made this entry?" "Clerk, same one who sold you the claim in the first place." "Where is he now?" "Gone. Took his pay and left for Denver 2 weeks ago." Outside on the narrow boardwalk, 2 of Doyle's riders were leaning against the hitching rail. When Bea and the girls stepped out, the men straightened. One was tall and thin with a scar across his chin. The other was shorter, thicker, with a revolver riding low on his hip. "You brought yourself a guard dog, teacher," the tall one said, flicking his eyes toward Chayton. Bea ignored him and started toward the mule. The shorter man stepped into her path. His hand drifted toward his revolver. "Boss says you should move on." Chayton moved. He did not hurry. He simply stepped forward so that Bea and the girls were behind his shoulder and let his rifle settle into a loose, ready position across his chest. His face was calm, but his eyes were not. The shorter man hesitated. His hand hovered over his gun. Bea's eyes found the cast-iron stoveplate leaning against the wall beside the land office, heavy flat about the size of a dinner plate. "Girls, down," she said sharply. Frida and Alma dropped to the boardwalk. The shorter man's hand closed on the grip of his revolver. Bea grabbed the stoveplate with both hands and swung it hard, a wide, desperate arc. Iron met bone with a dull, wet crack. The man's wrist bent at an ugly angle. The revolver clattered onto the boards and skidded into the dusty street. The tall man drew. Chayton's rifle was already on him, muzzle steady, aimed at his chest. "Enough," Chayton said softly. The street went silent. Faces appeared in windows. A woman stopped sweeping her porch. The tall man looked at the rifle, then at the watching faces, and slowly eased his hand away from his gun. "Tell Doyle we will see him soon," Bea said, breathing hard. The 2 men backed away, the shorter one cradling his wrist. They mounted their horses and rode out at a trot. Sheriff Pike appeared in the doorway of the general store, his hand resting on the butt of his own revolver. Too late to matter. "You should leave town, Bea," he said quietly. "I will," she said, "when I am ready." They rode back to the river bend in silence. This time Chayton stayed close, no longer pretending to be separate. When they reached the shelf, Bea climbed down and looked at the half-finished walls. They were still standing. The roof still leaked. But it was more than she had yesterday. "I cannot fight him with paper," she said. "No," Chayton agreed. "You cannot." "Then what do we do?" He looked at the river, then at the distant line of Doyle's fences cutting across the valley. "Water. Everything here depends on water." The creek that fed the river came down from the western hills. It was narrow, barely 3 feet wide in most places, but steady, fed by springs that did not dry up, even in summer. For years it had watered the Lakota fish camps and the few settler claims along this stretch of river. 2 months ago, Frederick Doyle had built a dam across it. The dam was rough work logs and stones piled into a narrow gorge, but it was effective. It diverted most of the creek's flow into a ditch that ran north to Doyle's upper pastures, leaving only a trickle to reach the river. The Lakota fish weirs downstream had started to dry up. Bee's well shallow to begin with was turning brackish. Chayton had scouted the dam twice. It was guarded during the day, but at night the riders grew lazy. They built fires, drank a whiskey, and relied on the fact that no one was foolish enough to tear down something that belonged to Frederick Doyle. But Chayton was not interested in tearing it down. Not yet. First, he needed proof that Doyle had built it illegally. 3 nights after the confrontation in town, Chayton took Bee and Wolfgang upriver. Wolfgang had appeared at the river bend the evening before, his face pale and his voice low. "I will help you," he had said. "But if Doyle finds out, he will kill me." "Then we make sure he does not find out," Chayton had replied. They left the horses hidden in a willow thicket and moved on foot through the mud and shallow water along the creek bank. The moon was down. The only light came from stars and the faint glow of a campfire farther upstream, where 2 of Doyle's men were supposed to be watching the dam. Bee's boot slipped on a wet rock. She gasped, arms flailing for balance. Before sound could escape, Chayton's hand clamped over her mouth, his other arm locking around her shoulders, pulling her back hard against his chest. She froze. His heartbeat hammered against her spine, fast, strong, alive. His breath was warm against her ear, warm against her. Voices approached along the bank. 2 men carrying a torch, joking about Doyle's plan to dry out the squatters, until they gave up and moved on. The torchlight passed inches from where they stood, pressed into the shadow of a willow trunk. Bee's lungs burned. Chayton's arm was an iron band around her ribs. His hand, rough and steady, covered her mouth so completely that she could not have made a sound if she tried. The men moved past. The torchlight faded. Chayton slowly loosened his arm. His hand slid from her mouth. She turned her head just enough to see his face and the starlight eyes, intent, unashamed, locked on hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he released her completely and motioned for them to keep moving. At the dam, they found what they needed. Burned into the logs with a branding iron was Doyle's cattle mark, a tilted D inside a circle. Fresh shovel marks scarred the ground where the ditch had been widened, and on the north side of the dam, someone had carved a rough tally into a flat stone, 14 claims cleared. 9 to go. Wolfgang stared at the tally, his jaw tight. "He keeps count," he muttered, "like it is a hunting score." Bee traced the numbers with her finger. "We need to take this to the sheriff." "Pike will not do anything," Wolfgang said. "He is afraid of Doyle." "Then we take it to someone who is not afraid," Bee said. Chayton's boot nudged something half buried in the mud. He crouched. Another beaded pouch. Inside, a small carved button bone etched with simple lines. His brother's work. He knew it instantly. "What is that?" Bee whispered. "Nothing," Chayton said, slipping it into his belt. But his mind was racing. Sewili had been here, recently, working for Doyle. The knowledge hit like a fist to the gut. He told himself it could not be true. Someone had stolen the pouches, traded them, but the evidence was piling up, and the suspicion he had been trying to ignore was hardening into cold certainty. They made it back downstream without incident. By the time they reached the river bend, the sky was starting to pale in the east. Over the next week, Bay began spending more time in town. She helped Eleonora at the small plank clinic on the edge of Buffalo Crossing, boiling bandages, grinding willow bark into powder, and holding squirming toddlers still while their wounds were cleaned. Eleonora paid her in food, and sometimes a few coins enough for nails and flour. But more importantly, Bee started learning. She learned that the Lakota mothers brought their children to Eleonora because the white doctor on Main Street refused to treat Indians. She learned bits of Lakota enough to comfort a frightened child with a clumsy word enough to understand when someone was talking about Doyle's fences or the dry fish weirs. One afternoon, an older woman named Winona spoke quietly while grinding herbs. "Chayton's brother," she said. "Sewili. He left, angry." Bee looked up. "Why?" "His woman died. Winter sickness. He blamed the elders. Said they chose pride over life." Winona's face was sad. Then he vanished. Some say they see him with white riders. Bee did not repeat this to Chayton, but she tucked it away, understanding a little more. One evening, as the sun sank low and red, Chayton arrived at the clinic limping. His buckskin leggings were dark with blood along his left thigh. Eleonora took one look and pointed to the examination table. "What happened?" "Standoff at the North Crossing." Chayton set his voice tight. "Someone fired. I was in the way." Eleonora peeled back the torn leather and cloth. The bullet had grazed the outer muscle of his thigh, a long, ugly groove that was bleeding freely, but had not hit bone or artery. "You are lucky," Eleonora said. "But this needs to be sealed or it will fester." She glanced at Bee, who was standing near the stove. "Heat the poker." Bee's stomach turned, but she nodded. She took the iron poker from the rack beside the stove and thrust it into the coals, pumping the bellows until the metal began to glow red. "Hold him still," Eleonora said. Chayton lay back on the table, his jaw clenched. Bee set the poker aside for a moment and gripped his leg just above the wound, her hands pressing into hard muscle. His whole body was tense, coiled like a spring. Eleonora lifted the glowing poker. "This will hurt." Chayton nodded once. Eleonora pressed the iron to the wound. The smell of burning flesh and scorched cloth filled the small room instantly. Chayton's fingers crushed the edge of the table. The tendons in his neck stood out like rope. But he did not shout. He did not cry out. Bee leaned closer, her hands tight on his leg, her face inches from his. Sweat ran down his temple. His eyes half closed, found hers and held. "Breathe," she whispered. He did. Slow, controlled breaths through his teeth. When Eleonora finally lifted the poker, the wound was sealed a black cauterized line that would leave a brutal scar, but would not kill him. Bee released his leg and stepped back, her hands shaking. Chayton sat up slowly, his face pale but composed. "Thank you," he said to Eleonora. "Thank Bee," Eleonora replied. "I could not have held you alone." Chayton looked at Bee. She looked back. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement, a recognition of shared pain and shared survival. It was not tenderness. It was something harder, more necessary. But it was real. Later outside, Chayton caught up with her as she was leaving. "You asked about my brother." She stopped. "Sewili is 22, Chayton said quietly. "He left months ago. His woman died. Hard winter. The elders refused to camp near the army rations. Said it would dishonor us. But honor does not fill cooking pots. He blamed them. Said they cared more about pride than keeping people alive." Chayton looked away toward the darkening hills. "He left angry. I have not seen him since." "You think he is alive?" Bee asked. "I do now," Chayton said. He showed her the pouches. "I found these near Doyle's fence, at the dam. He has been there. Working for Doyle, maybe." Bee's eyes widened. "What will you do?" "I do not know. Chayton said. It was honest, raw. Part of me wants to bring him home. Part of me understands why he left. Survival changes people, Bee said softly. Yes, Chayton said. It does. Water became the weapon. Doyle's men raised the dam higher, sending even more flow to the upper pastures. The shallow channel by Bee's shelf and the Lakota fish weirs began to dry up completely. Gates appeared along the riverbank, wooden ladders, and steps chained shut with heavy padlocks. Settlers who angered Doyle found axes taken to their water buckets or found their cattle turned away from the few remaining open fords. One morning, Bee found her mule dead in the makeshift corral behind the shelter. Its throat had been cut cleanly, and someone had left a note pinned to its ear with a nail. Next time it will be one of the girls. Bee stood over the body, her hands balled into fists, her breath coming in short, hard bursts. Chayton arrived an hour later. He looked at the mule, read the note, and said nothing. But his face went very still, and his hand tightened on his rifle. They are trying to break you, he said finally. They are succeeding, Bee said. No, Chayton said. If they had broken you, you would have left already. That night, Chayton moved his camp to a thicket a quarter-mile from the river bend. He did not ask permission. He simply appeared at dusk with his pony and a small bundle of gear and set up a lean-to in the willows. From there, he could see anyone approaching the shelf. The next morning, Bee found him boiling coffee over a small fire. You do not have to do this, she said. I know, he replied. He poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. But I am doing it anyway. Their fingers brushed. Neither pulled away. Why? She asked. He looked at the water, then at her. Because you are still here. Because you did not run. Because the girls need you alive. He paused. And because if Doyle takes this bend, he takes the camps next. Then my people have nothing. So this is survival, Bee said. Everything is survival, Chayton replied. But that does not make it less real. Fever broke out in the Lakota camp. It started with the children burning skin-rattling coughs, weakness that left them too tired to stand. Eleonora rode out with Bee and Chayton, her saddlebags full of willow bark clean cloth and a small bottle of laudanum. The camp was a collection of hide lodges and patched canvas shelters set in a hollow near the river where the wind did not cut so hard. Women boiled water over smoky fires. Old men sat wrapped in blankets, their faces carved deep with worry. Children lay on buffalo robes, their eyes glassy with fever. Eleonora worked without stopping. She showed the mothers how to brew willow bark tea, how to sponge fevered skin with cool water, how to prop a child up so the cough did not choke them. Bee helped learning as she went, her hands gentle on small bodies that burned like coals. One little girl, Wika, no more than 4, her mother dead the year before, clung to Bee's skirt and would not let go. Bee held her while Eleonora spooned medicine into her mouth, whispering soft, clumsy words in Lakota that she hoped meant, "You will be all right." Chayton watched from the edge of the camp, his rifle across his knees. When Bee finally emerged exhausted and streaked with soot, he handed her a water skin without a word. "She is so small," Bee said. "They all are," Chayton replied. "That is why we cannot let them take the water." Wolfgang's conscience was tearing him apart. He had taken Doyle's wages because he needed to eat, because the valley had no other work, because after the long, bitter journey west, he had been too tired to care who he worked for. But now, he was watching Doyle's men burn cabins, cut fences, and poison wells. He was hearing the laughter when riders came back from clearing out squatters. And he could not sleep. One night, Doyle ordered him to let trouble happen at the Lakota fish camp, meaning leave a gate open so cattle could ruin their nets and trample the weirs. Wolfgang nodded, rode out with the cattle, and then quietly turned the herd another direction. When he came back, Doyle tore into him for sloppy work in front of the other hands. Wolfgang took it in silence, his jaw tight. Later, he found Chayton at the river bend. "I am sorry," Wolfgang said. "I cannot stop all of it, but I can stop some." "Why are you doing this?" Chayton asked. "Because I remember the wagon train," Wolfgang said. "I remember when we had nothing and people helped us anyway." He rubbed his face. "I am tired of being the man who does not help." Chayton nodded slowly. "All right, then help us prove the dam is illegal." "How?" "We go to the land office. We find the old maps. We show that Doyle built on land he does not own." Wolfgang hesitated. "If he finds out I helped you, then you make sure he does not find out," Chayton said. One moonless night, they returned to the dam. This time they brought a saw. Working in silence, they cut halfway through one of the main support logs, not enough to make the dam collapse immediately, but enough to weaken it. When the next heavy rain came, the dam would fail. It was careful, dangerous work. Wolfgang held the lantern shielded by his coat. B kept watch. Chayton worked the saw, his movements slow and steady to keep the noise down. They were almost finished when voices erupted from upstream, 3 riders, not 2, and they were moving faster than usual. "Someone told them," Wolfgang hissed. Chayton pulled the saw free and gestured toward the willows. They ran low in fast boots sliding on wet rock. Behind them, a shout went up. A rifle cracked. The bullet whined past B's head and smacked into a tree trunk, showering splinters. They reached the willows and kept running. More shots followed, wild and angry. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath in a dry creek bed half a mile away, Chayton checked them over. "Anyone hit?" "No," Bay said, shaking. Wolfgang shook his head, pale and wide-eyed. "Then we move," Chayton said. "They will track us if we stay still." They made it back to the river bend as the sky began to lighten. B's legs were shaking. Wolfgang looked like he might be sick. But they had done what they came to do. "Now we wait for rain," Chayton said. 2 days later, B and Eleonora sat in the back room of the land office, surrounded by dusty ledgers and rolled maps. Sheriff Thaddeus stood in the doorway, smoking a cigarette and looking deeply uncomfortable. "I do not like this," he muttered. "You do not have to like it," Eleonora said without looking up. "You just have to let us look." They found the entry for B's claim first. As Thaddeus had said, it showed a transfer to Doyle's company on the basis of abandonment. But when Eleonora compared the handwriting to earlier entries made by the same clerk, the difference was obvious. The letters slanted differently. The ink was a different shade. Someone had forged the entry after the fact. "This is not legal," B said, her voice shaking. "Legal and enforced are 2 different things," Thaddeus said. They kept digging. In a side drawer, hidden beneath a stack of old tax receipts, they found an Army survey map from 1851. It showed the river bend marked as temporary reservation allotment during treaty talks that had ultimately collapsed. The notation read, "Pending federal resolution, not to be sold or claimed without approval." Eleonora spread the map on the table. "Doyle does not own this land. No one does. It is still in legal dispute before the territorial authorities." B stared at the map. "Then my husband's claim is not valid either." "No," Eleonora said. "But neither is Doyle's. We file a complaint with the territorial office. We make noise. And we hope someone in a bigger office cares enough to stop Doyle before he kills someone." Thaddeus stubbed out his cigarette. "You are playing with fire, Eleonora." "I have been playing with fire my whole life," Eleonora replied. "I am still standing." That same afternoon, Chayton rode north to scout Doyle's range. What he found shattered him. Sewili, guiding a line of cattle with 3 other riders. His younger brother alive, wearing white man's clothes, cotton shirt, wide-brimmed hat, leather vest. A rifle hung from his saddle. He looked more like a cowhand than a Lakota warrior. Chayton rode closer, his heart pounding so hard he could barely hear the wind. When Sewili saw him, his face went blank, but not before guilt flashed across it, sharp and unmistakable. "Brother," Sewili said. His voice was flat-guarded. "You work for him," Chayton said. It was not a question. It was an accusation. "I work for wages," Sewili replied. "Same as any man. He is strangling our river, driving our people off the land." "Our land?" Sewili's voice went sharp, bitter. "We do not own the land, Chayton. We do not own anything. The whites took it all, and you still pretend we have something left to protect." Chayton's jaw tightened. "We have our people. We have the fish camps. We have nothing." Sewili interrupted, his voice rising. "We have nothing. I watched Ina die 2 winters ago because the elders would not camp near the army beef rations. They said it would dishonor us. But honor does not fill cooking pots. It does not keep a woman alive when she is coughing blood into her hands." Ina, bright, laughing girl with beads in her hair. She had grown thin and silent that winter. By spring, she was gone. "I am sorry," Chayton said quietly. "I did not know it was that bad." "Your sorrow does not bring her back," Sewili said. His eyes were hard, but there was pain beneath the hardness. "Doyle's money buys beef. Beef keeps people alive. That is all I care about now." "He is destroying everything we have left," Chayton said. "Then what we have is not strong enough to survive," Sewili said. He gathered his reins. "I am done fighting wars we already lost. I choose survival over honor." He rode away without looking back. Chayton sat on his pony for a long time, staring at the distant line of cattle. When he finally returned to the river bend hours later, his face was like stone. Bee saw it immediately. "What happened?" Long silence. Then quietly he told her. "The pouches. The tracking. Seeing Sewili with Doyle's men. He chose survival." Chayton said, his voice hollow. "And I cannot condemn him for that. But he is helping the man who is trying to kill us." Bee said nothing. She simply stood beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. A silent presence. "I am sorry," she said finally. "So am I," Chayton said. In that moment, something shifted between them. Bee realized her fear was no longer just for herself and the girls. It extended to this man who stood beside her. And Chayton realized that protecting the bend meant protecting her. And that had become as important as protecting his people. Survival had bound them. Somewhere along the way, it had become something more. Doyle moved with ruthless efficiency. 2 days later, 4 of his men walked into the clinic yard in broad daylight. They grabbed Frida and Alma while the girls were playing with a stray dog. Frida screamed and fought. Alma bit one man's hand so hard he cursed and nearly dropped her. But they were children, and the men were armed. By the time Eleonora ran out, the girls were already being lifted onto horses. "What in blazes do you think you are doing?" Eleonora shouted. "Boss wants to see the teacher," one of the men said. His hand rested on his revolver. "We are just making sure she shows up. You try to stop us, we burn this place with you in it." They rode out at a gallop with the girls struggling and crying. Eleonora found Bee at the general store and told her. Bee's face went white. Where did they take them? Doyle's ranch? Bee ran for the mule, then remembered it was dead. She borrowed a horse from the livery, paying with the last coins she had, and rode hard for Doyle's ranch. Chayton saw her go. He followed at a distance. Frederick Doyle's ranch was a sprawling, ugly structure of milled lumber and rough stone, sitting on a low hill like a scar on the land. Corrals and outbuildings spread around it. Smoke rose from the cookhouse chimney. Men moved in and out of the barns carrying saddles and coils of rope. When Bee rode into the yard, 3 men stepped forward, hands on their guns. One took her horse's bridle. "Boss is waiting," he said. They led her to the main house. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco and old sweat. Doyle sat at a long dining table, a sheaf of papers spread in front of him. He was a thick man in his 50s, with a heavy jaw and pale blue eyes that looked at her the way a butcher looks at a calf. Frida and Alma sat on a bench against the wall, guarded by a man with a shotgun. Alma was crying. Frida's face was set and furious. "Miss B." Alma cried, her voice small and frightened. "I am here," B said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Let them go." Doyle tapped the papers in front of him with one thick finger. "I will," he said. His voice was mild, conversational. "As soon as you sign this." B looked down. It was a deed transferring her claim to the Doyle Cattle Company. Doyle leaned back in his chair, studying her face, with the calm attention of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. "You sign your claim to me," he said, still mild, "and your little charity projects keep breathing. You refuse, and I sell them south with my next beef shipment." He paused, smiled. It did not reach his eyes. Those mining camps do not ask questions about papers. Little girls fetch good prices as servants, among other things. Bee's hands curled into fists. Her breath came short. "You would sell children?" Doyle tilted his head slightly, as if considering an interesting question. "I find," he said softly, "that people are more reasonable when they understand what is at stake." "You seem like a reasonable woman, Mrs. Albrecht. Are you a reasonable woman?" He pushed the pen across the table. Bee looked at Frida and Alma. Alma was still crying. Frida mouthed silently, "Do not do it." But Bee thought about the mining camps. She thought about the stories she had heard, children vanishing into tunnels, into brothels, into unmarked graves. And she thought about the fact that she had promised to keep these girls safe. She picked up the pen. Beneath her signature, she made a small, deliberate ink blot, the signal Eleonora had told her to use if she ever signed under duress. Doyle took the deed and smiled, showing yellow teeth. "There," he said pleasantly. "Was that so hard?" Then he stood and gestured for her to follow him onto the porch. Outside, a dozen of his men had gathered in the yard waiting. Doyle raised his voice. "Miss Albrecht has something to say." Bee looked at him confused and afraid. One of the men dragged Alma onto the porch, holding a revolver loosely against her back. Alma whimpered. "Tell them," Doyle said, his voice still pleasant, still cold, "that the Lakota man you have been hiding is a murderer. Tell them he killed Lucas Hart in cold blood. Tell them anyone who helps Indians will hang with him." Bee's heart hammered. "I will not." The gun pressed harder against Alma's spine. Alma cried out. "Tell them," Doyle repeated, his voice soft as silk. "Or I have him shoot her now, then the other one." Bee closed her eyes. Then she opened them and spoke, her voice loud and clear, hating every word. "The man called Chayton is dangerous. He killed Lucas Hart. Anyone who helps him or his people is breaking the law and will face justice." The men nodded, muttering among themselves, satisfied. Doyle smiled. In the cottonwoods beyond the yard, Chayton stood frozen. He had crept close, planning to scout the house and find a way in. Wolfgang crouched beside him, pale and tense. They had both heard every word. Chayton's face went hard as stone. The woman he had begun to trust to care for had just called him a murderer in front of witnesses. He turned and walked back toward the trees without a word. "Wait," Wolfgang whispered urgently. She was forced. "You saw the gun?" But Chayton was already gone, vanishing into the shadows, his heart hardening with every step. 2 days later, Doyle moved to end it. He loaded a wagon with dynamite crates of it purchased from a mining outfit in the next valley. His plan was simple: blow apart the rock shelf under B's shelter, deepen the ford for his cattle, and permanently destroy the Lakota fishing spots downstream. It would be a show of power proof that no one, not settlers, not Indians, could stand in his way. He brought B and the girls along in a buckboard, their hands tied. "You will watch," he told B, his voice cold and satisfied. "And then you will thank me for making your mistake disappear." 15 armed men rode with him. The wagon, heavy with explosives, rolled slowly along the narrow trail above the river. Wolfgang, who had been ordered to ride with the column, found a chance to slip away when the men stopped to water their horses. He spurred hard, his horse lathered and blowing, until he found Chayton near the Lakota camp, sitting alone on a flat rock, staring at nothing. "He is coming," Wolfgang gasped, sliding from the saddle. "With dynamite, everything. He has B and the girls." Chayton's face did not change, but his hand tightened on his rifle until his knuckles went white. "How many men?" 15, maybe more. Chayton stood slowly. He turned to the men and women of the camp, who had begun to gather, sensing trouble. "We cannot fight 15 rifles head-on," he said, "but we can stop the wagon." They moved fast. Chayton took 5 warriors with rifles, older men who remembered how to fight from cover. They rode hard to the narrow section of trail above the bend and set up an ambush. Ropes stretched low across the path between 2 cottonwoods. Rifles sighted from prone positions behind sage and rock. Eleonora, who had insisted on coming despite Chayton's protests, took position with a shotgun behind a fallen log. "I am a doctor," she said, "but I am tired of watching evil men win." The column reached the narrow section just as the sun began to sink toward the hills. Chayton waited, barely breathing, until the lead horses were 3 strides from the rope. Then he gave a sharp whistle. The rope snapped taut with a crack like a whip. Horses reared and screamed. Riders tumbled crashing into the dirt. The wagon lurched violently to one side. One wheel lifted. Dynamite crates slid rattling with sickening thuds. One box tumbled off the wagon entirely, hitting the ground hard. It did not detonate, but it landed at a precarious angle, balanced on a sharp rock. The world erupted into chaos. Chayton's rifle barked sharp clean. A rider fell, grabbing his shoulder, blood spraying. Another shot cracked from the hillside. A second man grabbed his leg and toppled from the saddle, screaming. Doyle's men fired back. Blind panicked. Bullets whined through the branches. One grazed Chayton's arm, tearing buckskin and burning a line across his skin. Another slammed into the tree beside his head, showering splinters. Powder smoke drifted thick and choking. Horses bolted, eyes white with terror. The wagon rolled forward, its driver slumped dead over the seat. The box that had fallen earlier shifted, sliding closer to the sharp rock beneath it. On the buckboard, B saw her moment. Her hands were tied, but she used her shoulder to shove Alma and Frida off the seat. She rolled them behind a fallen log and threw her own body over theirs, shielding them with her flesh. Splinters hissed through the air overhead. A bullet punched through the buckboard's sideboards, missing Frida's head by inches. B looked up through the smoke and saw Chayton, limping, blood on his arm, face streaked with dirt, and blood rifle still in his hands, fighting for them. Their eyes met across the chaos. He nodded once. "Sharp. I understand. I know." She nodded back, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. Forgive me. The storm that had been building all afternoon finally broke over the creek's headwaters. 10 miles upstream, rain pounded down in savage sheets, pouring off hillsides and gathering speed and volume as it funneled into the narrow creek channel. Upstream, the weakened dam groaned under the sudden massive pressure. Water forced through cracks, eroding the foundation with relentless power. Logs shifted. The whole structure shuddered. Then, with a deafening crack like a cannon shot, the dam failed. Water exploded through the shattered structure in a roaring wall, a living thing possessed, tearing down the creek bed, slamming boulders aside, ripping willow thickets from the earth, surging toward the main river with unstoppable force. At the bend, the peaceful water transformed in seconds. The water level rose 3 feet, 5 feet, 7 feet, climbing with terrifying speed. The bank beneath B's shelter collapsed with a deep tearing sound, the sound of earth ripping apart. Boards and gear were dragged into the churning brown torrent. Frida, scrambling for footing on the wet rocks, slipped. The current grabbed her instantly, a giant hand that swept her toward the main channel with horrifying speed. "Frida!" B screamed, lunging. Chayton did not hesitate. In a single heartbeat, he pulled a rawhide rope from his belt, knotted it around his chest, and threw the free end toward the bank. A figure caught it, Siwili suddenly there, blood streaming from a wound on his arm and another in his side, his face tight with pain, but his grip strong and sure. "Hold it," Chayton said, his voice iron. Siwili wrapped the rope twice around a cottonwood trunk. "Go," he said simply, his eyes meeting his brother's for the first time in months. Chayton dove into the flood without another word. The current slammed him sideways, immediate and brutal. Floating boards battered him. Torn brush tangled around his legs. His old thigh wound screamed. The fresh bullet graze was agony. Muddy water filled his mouth and nose, choking him. But he kicked hard, fighting the current with every ounce of strength, angling toward the small shape, tumbling in the brown chaos. He caught Frida under one arm and pulled her against his chest, shielding her head from the debris battering them. He kicked toward a narrow sandbar, forming against a cluster of rocks, his muscles screaming, his vision going dark at the edges. B was already there, waist deep in surging water, one hand locked on Alma's dress, the other reaching desperately toward Frida. Chayton shoved the girl toward her with the last of his strength. B grabbed Frida and dragged her onto the rocks, both of them coughing and gasping. On the bank, Siwili leaned back with all his weight boots digging furrows into the mud. The rope bit into his palms, cutting through skin and muscle. Blood ran down his wrists in rivulets. Behind him, Doyle, half wild with rage, grabbed a carbine from a dead man's saddle and raised it to his shoulder. He sighted carefully, taking his time, aiming straight at Chayton's exposed back as he struggled in the water. Wolfgang saw it. He was crouched behind a stump, bleeding heavily from a shoulder wound, barely able to stay upright. He saw Doyle's finger tighten on the trigger. There was no time to shout. He charged with the last of his strength. The carbine cracked. Wolfgang slammed into Doyle just as the bullet left the barrel. Instead of punching through Chayton's spine, the bullet tunneled through Wolfgang's chest, tearing through lung and rib with devastating mortal force. The two men crashed together at the very edge of the rain-soaked bank. The earth, saturated and unstable, sheared away beneath their combined weight. Doyle clawed desperately for purchase, his fingers catching a clump of grass, but Wolfgang's dying body dragged him relentlessly over the edge. They hit the churning water together. The current took them instantly, rolling them under. Doyle surfaced once, choking his arms, flailing his eyes wide with stark terror. Then a surge of brown water pulled him under. He did not come up again. Wolfgang surfaced 20 yards downstream, his face white as chalk, blood pouring from his mouth and staining the water crimson. With the very last ember of strength, he looked toward the bank where Siwili was struggling with the rope. then toward the fallen dynamite box lodged in the shallows near where Bee and the girls were clinging to the rocks. The current was pushing it slowly, inexorably toward them. If it hit the rocks with enough force or was struck by debris at the wrong angle, it would detonate. It would kill them all. Wolfgang made his choice. With his last breath, his vision fading to black, he kicked toward the box. His fingers closed on it. Using the current, he pulled it with him away from the rocks, away from Bee and the girls, away from everyone, out toward the open water. 3 seconds later, delayed reaction from an earlier impact, the dynamite detonated. The explosion tore through the midstream with a deafening roar that echoed across the valley. A massive column of water shot skyward. The blast wave rolled outward, brutal and deafening spray, rising 100 feet into the air. But Wolfgang had pulled it far enough away. The rock shelf held. The people were safe. Wolfgang's sacrifice was complete. On the bank, Siwili's grip was failing. The rope had cut so deep into his hands that they were slick with blood. His arms shook with exhaustion. The wounds in his side and arm were bleeding heavily. With a hoarse, wordless cry, he wrapped the rope around his forearm one final time and braced it with his entire body leaning back until his spine bent like a bow. Chayton fought the current with everything he had left, dragging Bee and Frida inch by desperate inch toward the sandbar. When they were close enough, 2 Lakota warriors waded in and pulled them to safety. Chayton climbed the muddy bank, gasping and bleeding. Siwili collapsed beside the cottonwood. A stray bullet, fired wildly during the chaos, had punched into his chest below the collarbone. Another had torn through his side. Blood soaked his shirt, spreading fast. Too fast. Chayton dropped to his knees beside him. "Brother." Siwili coughed, blood flecking his lips. His eyes found Chayton's face and softened regret, love, peace. "Sorry," he whispered, barely audible. "So angry. Lost. But when I saw you fighting, what you were protecting, I remembered." "Remembered what?" Chayton's voice was breaking. He gripped his brother's hand, desperate. "Who I am," Siwili said, a faint smile. "Who we are. Lakota. Warriors. Protectors." He coughed again, more blood. "Do not let them, damn it, again. Let our children fish. Remember, before." "I will," Chayton said, tears streaming down his face. "I swear it. On everything sacred. On your name." Siwili's eyes closed slowly. "Good." He breathed barely a whisper. "Glad I came back. Glad I held the rope. Tell them Siwili came home." His hand went slack. He was gone. Chayton stayed there, kneeling in the mud rain, beginning to fall and mix with his tears. For a long moment he did not move. Then Bee limped over, dragging Frida and Alma with her. She touched his shoulder gently. "I am sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "He saved us. He was a hero." Chayton did not answer. He simply lifted Siwili's body with infinite care and carried him slowly toward the camp, his steps heavy and deliberate. The rain continued, washing the blood from the earth. When the waters receded hours later, the bend was transformed. Devastation everywhere, driftwood, torn gear, muddy banks. The dynamite wagon lay on its side, empty boxes scattered like broken teeth. Bodies, mostly Doyle's men, were pulled from the shallows and laid out in a grim line beneath the cottonwoods. Sheriff Pike arrived late in the afternoon with a handful of townsmen. He stood at the edge of the wreckage, his face pale. "What happened here?" "Doyle tried to blow the bend," Eleonora said flatly, her dress muddy, a streak of blood on her cheek. "We stopped him. He is dead. So are his men. And Wolfgang Eberhardt and Siwili both gave their lives to save others." Pike looked at the bodies and then at the wreckage. "Where is Doyle?" "Drowned," Eleonora said. "The current took him. He is miles downstream by now, if the river did not already bury him." Pike rubbed his face, suddenly looking much older. I need statements. You need to look at these, Eleonora interrupted sharply, handing him an oilskin pouch. Doyle's claim was fraudulent. So was his transfer of B's property. Wolfgang left a written statement with me 3 weeks ago. It lists every illegal act, the dam, the fires, the threats, the murders. You want the truth? There it is. Pike read slowly, his jaw working. When he finished, he looked at B. You signed your claim over to him. Under duress, B said steadily. There is a mark beneath my signature. Dr. Finch can verify it. He held children at gunpoint and threatened to sell them. The transfer is not valid. Eleonora nodded. Any honest judge will invalidate it. Pike sighed heavily. This is going to be a mess. It already is a mess, Eleonora said coldly. Do your job. For once. 3 weeks passed. Territorial authorities descended less interested in justice than in avoiding a scandal. They moved quickly. Bay's patent was reinstated. The forged entries were voided. Doyle's company, leaderless and drowning in debt, was broken apart by creditors. On paper, the Bend now belonged solidly to Beatrice Albrecht. But B understood that paper was only as strong as the people willing to defend it. Autumn came early that year, laying a rust-colored hush over the valley. The cottonwoods turned brilliant yellow. The river, freed from the broken dam, flowed strong and clear and cold. On the shelf above the Bend, a new structure stood where the crooked lean-to had once struggled against the wind. It was solid, a single-room building part, schoolhouse part, dwelling with plumb walls and a tight roof. Lakota men and immigrant farmers had raised it together using timber salvaged from Doyle's storehouses. It was not fancy, but it was strong. Inside, B ran a small school. Lakota children sat beside settler children at rough benches, learning their letters and numbers. Frida and Alma helped the younger children. On the wall hung a board with simple rules written in English and Lakota: be kind. Share water. Help those who need it. Remember those who died so we could learn here. One cool evening, after the children had left, B sat at the table with good paper and Eleonora's steel pen. She wrote slowly, carefully, I, Beatrice Albrecht, being of sound mind, do hereby will this land and all structures upon it, to Frida Braun and Alma Braun, when they reach their majority, with the express understanding that the Lakota band, led by Chayton, shall have perpetual right to fish camp, water their horses, and pass freely across this land, as long as they wish, without payment or hindrance of any kind. It was not perfect. White law did not recognize such promises as truly binding, but it was the strongest shield she could create. She folded the papers, sealed the envelope, and gave it to Eleonora for safekeeping. If something happens to me, make certain they understand. I will, Eleonora said. But nothing will happen to you. Outside, Chayton stood on the bank, watching the current slide past, smooth, unbroken, free of dams, flowing as it had for thousands of years. But he knew nothing stayed fixed for long. Sooner or later, another fight would come. But for now, the water ran free, and his brother's sacrifice had bought them time. B joined him, her worn skirts brushing his buckskin leggings. They stood in silence, listening to the steady voice of the current. You are safe now, Chayton said quietly. Under your paper. For the moment, B replied honestly. But we both know who really kept this place standing. He shook his head slightly. Many people. Wolfgang, who gave his life. Siwili, who remembered at the end. Eleonora, who fights with paper and medicine. The warriors. Even the current itself, it rose up when we needed it. A cool breeze lifted the fringe on his sleeve. B reached out slowly, as if to smooth it. She stopped, her fingers hovering. He looked at her and nodded once, granting permission. She let her hand rest lightly on his arm, a quiet contact witnessed only by the water and the fading sky. Chayton reached up and carefully removed a single feather from his feathered headband, not the tallest or the brightest, but one worn smooth by rain and smoke and time. Without ceremony, he tucked it carefully into a narrow crack beneath the schoolhouse eave. "That is not a claim," he said. "Then what is it?" Bee asked. "A reminder that we built this together, that it belongs to all of us, your people and mine, that blood was spilled for something worth keeping. Will you come back?" she asked, needing to hear it. "Yes," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "I will always come back. When snow falls and the children need firewood, when spring floods threaten the banks, when summer brings drought and the well runs low. Whenever you need help, I will be here. This is home now." They both understood. A public marriage was impossible. The law would not recognize it. The town would turn against them. The fragile peace would shatter. But they had something deeper than a marriage license. They had survived together, fought together, bled together, built something that mattered, a place where children could learn, where people could fish, where water ran free. Bee reached into her pocket and pulled out a small stone, smooth gray, worn perfectly round by countless years tumbling in the current. She held it out. "What is this?" Chayton asked, taking it carefully. "A promise," Bee said, "that as long as I hold this land, as long as I draw breath, your people will always have a place here. Water, safety, home. The paper says it legally. This stone says it in my heart." He looked at the stone, feeling its weight, then at her face in the dying light. "And what can I give you? I have no land, no paper." "You already gave it," she said softly, her voice thick. "You stood with me when I had nothing. No one else would risk it. You fought for my children as if they were your own blood. You trusted me even after I was forced to betray you. That is enough. That is everything." He closed his hand around the stone and held it against his chest for a moment. Then he tucked it carefully into the medicine pouch at his belt, next to the beaded items that had belonged to Siwili. "I will keep this," he said, "and I will come back. That is my promise." "I know," she said simply, believing completely. They stood together as the last light faded the current, singing its endless song. No miraculous transformation, no perfectly tied endings. Just a hard-won refuge held together by paper and memory, and two people who had chosen not to let the river be dammed or the weak be crushed without a fight. Frida appeared in the doorway. "Miss B, supper is ready." B turned toward the light spilling from inside. "Coming." Chayton touched his hand briefly to his heart, then to the feather tucked beneath the eave, a gesture of respect, a promise of return. "Soon," he said. "Yes," B answered, smiling through tears. "Soon." He mounted his paint horse and turned north toward the Lakota camp, a dark silhouette against the deepening blue. B watched until he disappeared. Then she turned and walked back toward the schoolhouse, toward the warmth and light and voices of children waiting. The door closed softly. The lamp inside glowed steady and golden, and on the shelf above the bend, the current continued its ancient journey, free wild theirs, to protect as long as they had strength to stand. The feather and the stone remained small symbols of a bond forged in fire and sealed in blood, promising that some things, some promises between people who have survived together, are stronger than paper, deeper than law, more enduring than empires built on greed.